It is my privilege today to welcome Dr. Raynard Kington as our distinguished speaker this afternoon. But before I begin with this introduction, I would like to take a moment to welcome University of Iowa President Bruce Harold and his wife Mary, and other members of the university administration. As well as all of our University of Iowa healthcare faculty, staff, students, and volunteers, and all the community members who are here today to join us in commemorating Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy. I am proud to say that recognition of Dr. King's birth date has been a tradition at the University of Iowa since 1969, and the MLK National Holiday has been observed on campus since 1986. Beginning in 1995, an official university holiday was established to give members of the university community the opportunity to fully reflect on the values that the King holiday represents. Today, it is a campus-wide celebration, bringing together faculty, staff, students, and the community through discussion, arts, and music, food, and events such as today's lecture. But remembering Dr. King should not be limited to the third Monday or third week of January every year. The impact of his words and his actions can be felt every day across our nation and indeed the world. Let us honor Dr. King's legacy throughout the year by putting into practice the values of diversity, openness, and inclusion, and our recruitment of students, faculty, and staff, and our collaborations with peers and partners, and in our daily interactions with patients, clients, and colleagues, and each other. I would like to take a moment to recognize the UI Healthcare Human Rights Week Committee for their efforts in planning and promoting this week's events. Led by the committee's chair, Dr. Kanya Ferguson, would all the committee members please stand to be recognized? I would also like to take this opportunity to honor the 2019 recipient of the UI Healthcare's Culturally Responsive Healthcare Award. This award is given each year to honor an individual or group for providing and promoting care that recognizes the social and cultural backgrounds of our patients and their families and emphasizes our commitment to inclusion, empathy, and understanding. This year's award goes to Trudy LaFoon, who is nurse manager in dermatology and surgery specialty services ambulatory nursing. Trudy has been a leader in a number of initiatives that support the delivery of culturally responsive care to patients and families, as well as cultural awareness and respect for colleagues and coworkers. Trudy helped establish an interprofessional diversity committee within the shared governance structure of the Department of Nursing Services at UI hospitals and clinics. And she's chaired the committee since its beginning in 2016, and the group's activities have included educational programs related to patient diversity, partnering with the UI Healthcare Office of Cultural Affairs and Diversity Initiatives, and planning our annually Culturally Responsive Healthcare in Iowa conference, and identifying resources to enhance our providers' knowledge and application of concepts of diversity and inclusion. Last year, Trudy led efforts to administer a culturally and linguistically appropriate service assessment to all nursing staff, followed by educational sessions to her fellow committee members who then share the information with their respective nursing units and divisions. Her dedication to culturally responsive healthcare also extends to the students she teaches at Kirkwood Community College as an adjunct instructor, and it is reflected in a research study she is conducting as part of her Doctor of Nursing practice degree program through the UI College of Nursing. Her study is an assessment of an international clinical practicum experience and how it impacts nursing students' cultural competencies, and this study will help inform and shape future nursing courses here at Iowa. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating the 2019 recipient of the Culturally Responsive Healthcare Award, Trudy LaFoon. And now to our guest lecturer. Dr. Raynard Kington was appointed president of Grinnell College in August 2010. Before coming to Grinnell, he served in several key leadership positions at the National Institutes of Health, including Principal Deputy Director and Acting Director, Associate Director for Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, and Acting Director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Before joining the NIH, he was a Division Director at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where he led the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, one of the nation's largest studies assessing the health of the American people. He was elected to the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, in 2006, and he currently serves on the Academy's Governing Council. Dr. Kington also serves on the Board of Directors of the American Council on Education, as well as the Des Moines Art Center, the American Civil Liberties Union of Iowa, and the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. He earned his bachelor's and medical degrees at the University of Michigan, and he completed a medical residency in internal medicine at the Michael Reese Medical Center in Chicago. While serving as a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Kington completed his MBA with distinction and also earned a PhD with concentration on health policy and economics at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. As president of Grinnell, Dr. Kington has emphasized collaboration and communication in promoting inclusive leadership and strengthening Grinnell's longstanding commitment to academic excellence in the arts, humanities, sciences, and social studies. I would like to take this moment to remind everyone that we will have a brief Q&A session following Dr. Kington's remarks, and we have handheld microphones available for asking questions. And please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so, or mute them at this point. And so now it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium our speaker for the 2019 UI Healthcare Martin Luther King Jr. Distinguished Lecture. Please welcome Dr. Raynard Kington. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm double mic'd here, so I hope this is okay. I've never been double mic'd before. Well, thank you for this invitation to deliver this year's MLK Distinguished Lecture. Now, Martin Luther King Day is a day of reflection for me and for many of you. But this year, I feel a bit more pensive than usual in thinking about the legacy of Dr. King. You see, earlier this month, I traveled to a small community in Northeast Texas to attend the funerals of two of my late mother's siblings, both of whom I knew and loved and admired. They died within 3 days of each other, and their funerals were scheduled one after the other on the same Saturday, January 12th, in that small community where my mother was raised and where I visited as a child regularly. They were buried in the family gravesite in that community. It was a community founded by freed slaves after the Civil War. In fact, when my parents died, my siblings and I inherited land that was part of the same plantation where my ancestors were enslaved, land that's now been in the family 5 generations. Now, at the end of the Civil War, the slave master, who was actually my great-great-great-grandfather, a Confederate officer, deeded the land to this one plantation to his former slaves, a number of whom were his direct descendants, presumably as an act of atonement. And this allowed them to form this independent community in the middle of an incredibly changing world. My uncle, whom we called Uncle Honey, after either his childhood disposition or the color of his hair, was 101 at his death. He was a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army, a 1938 history major graduate of a liberal arts HBCU, Texas College, who was in the first wave of African-American men allowed into officer training school after the military desegregated in the 1940s. My aunt, whom her nieces and nephews called Little Aunt, this was the South, was 92 and was a beloved and devoted school teacher. Now, their immediate and extended families gathered for these 2 burials. My uncle's casket was carried to the graveyard by a caisson with horses. It was quite a sight. especially because 100 years ago in this small community, the coffins were taken in a similar wagon from the church that's at the center of this little community down the road to the cemetery. And while I was waiting in the family cemetery where my mother and my father's ashes are buried, I decided to visit with the graves of ancestors. It was a moving experience for me to wander again among these graves, which I had visited many times before. In fact, during our family reunion, there's a tradition of setting aside time for the family to gather at that gravesite and go from grave to grave and speak about each person. In this way, we keep the stories of our ancestors alive. I visited the graves of my grandparents, both of whom were children of slaves, who were the first in their families to go to college. They became school teachers and ran a family farm and a small store. I wandered over the graves of at least 3 of my great-grandparents, all of whom were born as slaves. I stood beside the graves of several of my great-great-grandparents, most of whom had spent most of their lives as slaves, at least one of whom was by oral history born in Africa in the late 1700s. Another was a Cherokee Indian who had been moved along the Trail of Tears until ultimately allowed to leave the reservation in Tennessee and ultimately marrying into this black community. When I was a boy, I felt like these visits to this distant family cemetery in Texas was something to be endured. But this year, perhaps more than ever, I felt something in the presence of these ancestors. I thought of the constant uncertainty and unbelievable upheaval they must have faced. I thought of the stories I knew about their joys and their struggles, and I thought of the stories they undoubtedly didn't share, the private woes and worries and defeats that they took with them to the grave. I've always taken great comfort from the poem Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. And I've been thinking about it a lot in recent weeks as I navigated some discomfort at Grinnell, as I thought a lot about uncertainty. And I'll share the poem with you now. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I've been a climbing on and reaching lands and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back now. Don't you sit down on the steps, because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still going, honey. I'm still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I love that line. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's restoring in so many ways to remember the legacies of our ancestors, the stories of triumph or the humorous anecdotes that get passed along from each individual before they move off this earthly plane. All families have them. But our ancestors also speak in a collective voice sometimes, reminding us of who we came from and how they struggled so that we might know privileges and freedoms they only dreamed of. Now, I love that Hughes poem. I love how this poem, written from a fictional to a son, could also work as a whole chorus of voices reminding us, all of us, that we have what we have largely because of the sacrifices that came before us. Now, this lecture takes place at another time for remembering legacies, especially the legacies of those who struggled against almost unimaginable antagonistic forces, the legacies of the great leaders and of the countless ordinary people who simply endured and maintained their humanity no matter how they were treated. Ordinary people like all of the people buried in that cemetery in Texas. A legacy embodied by the man we honor today, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, on October 29th, 1967, Dr. King gave a speech at Grinnell, his last speech in Iowa. It was entitled Remaining Awake During a Revolution, and it was a part of a symposium on the liberal arts college in a changing world. The event's various anniversaries, 25 years, 40 years, 50 years, have been celebrated by the college and even covered by national media. And each time this historic speech is commemorated, everyone involved in the commemoration, including me, says something like, King's words are more relevant today than ever, or Dr. King's message speaks directly to our current political moment. And that's usually true. It's an excellent, inspiring speech, and it is still very relevant today. And yet the fact that this message of social justice and equality always feels urgent and contemporary, the fact that it always seems as if it is speaking to a current national divide is discouraging. It's wearying that that speech is still somehow one that we need to hear. One wonders if we at Grinnell will ever be able to have a celebration of the anniversary of this speech and feel it is not speaking directly to our contemporary condition. Will there ever be a time when the speech is not a call to action, but a reminder of how far we've come? How can we, more than 5 decades later, still need to hear speeches that aim to convince us of the merits of equality and justice and inclusion? Haven't we won those battles already? I wish the answer was yes, but as all of you know, the battles that Dr. King fought are still being fought. Great progress has been made in the civil rights arena, no doubt, and yet so much more work needs to be done. And while great progress has been made, the forces of division in this country and their ability to inhibit dialogue and cooperation have grown fiercer and stronger in recent years. At times, the atmosphere of division infects everyone on every side of every debate. How wearying it can be, how tempting it is just to sit down on the steps. 51 years ago in Grinnell, Dr. King actually faced some very rough winds, literally, and complicated air travel on the way to Iowa that afternoon. When he finally arrived at the tiny airport in Grinnell, greeted by a coalition from town that included a former FBI agent turned bodyguard for a day and the local chief of police. Now, Dr. King was several hours late, and everyone waited several hours for the speech. The crowd included numerous civil rights leaders and intellectuals and journalists and artists who were there to participate in this symposium. Benjamin Mays, the president of Morehouse, who was King's mentor, was at the meeting and introduced him. The audience was eagerly awaiting his speech, which he delivered powerfully and eloquently. And then almost immediately after delivering his remarks, rather than bask in the glow of admiration that was certainly there in Darby Gym that day, Dr. King had to rush out early so that he could go and serve a jail sentence. This one day in the life of Dr. King is almost a metaphor for his career. He always knew that good work would be hard work. Good work, social justice work, healing work, any work that aims to relieve the suffering of other humans is always chaotic and brutal and unpredictably challenging. When our hearts are in the right place, it is no guarantee that the work ahead will be easy. It's no guarantee that those that we consider allies will always be our allies. It's not even a guarantee that the accomplishments we achieve, the progress we make, will be permanent. Social justice work is the kind of work that's never done. It's a victory that's never fully won. For one thing, our definition of what is just appropriately continually evolves. Issues of justice are nuanced and multifaceted and require the navigation of complex systems. In addition, social justice work is not all or nothing work. It requires compromise, and it requires stamina. It requires an ability to see the good in small steps toward our goals and a willingness to accept that small steps are still, in fact, steps forward. Now, in 1890, 25 years after the end of the Civil War, after the end of the institution of slavery that he had given his life to defeating, Frederick Douglass gave another famous speech on civil rights, a speech entitled The Race Problem. Now, Douglass was nearing the end of his life at this time. He spoke to the Bethel Literary and Historical Association, which was gathered at the Metropolitan AME Church of Washington, a church where he gave a number of his famous speeches, particularly at the end of his life, and a church where his funeral was held 5 years after this speech. Now, when he spoke, he wasn't given a nostalgic, retrospective speech about the way he and his fellow abolitionists, including the founders of Grinnell, helped to destroy the evil institution of slavery. No, this was not a victory lap. Rather than looking back proudly at the nation's victory over a system as evil and demeaning as slavery, Douglass had to acknowledge and lament the nation's deepening racism, even after the Civil War. He had to acknowledge that there were laws and systems of oppression that had sprung up as an alternative to slavery, systems that had the continued oppression of African Americans as their core objective. I often wonder how exhausted Frederick Douglass must have felt in writing this speech. A generation after slavery was abolished, he was still dealing with just another insidious system of racism and oppression in the U.S., one that was often embedded in state governments. To quote Douglass, he said, "But now, though all of this has been done, though slavery has been abolished, though the Negro has been freed, though he has become a citizen, though the Union has been saved in part by valor, the Negro is not to be let off quite yet. He is to be made the victim of a New Deal by precipitating upon the country a false issue. He is to face another problem." As his lengthy speech continues, one can feel the anger and exhaustion in the text. And the capacity crowd gathered in that church probably heard it in the great orator's voice. But one also gets the sense that Douglass was not surprised. He knew how to speak out again and again. And he knew that the victories in the realm of social justice were usually not permanent ones. They are victories that must be defended and upheld generation after generation. Maybe his goal that evening was to arouse those who would follow, the activists of future generations, so that they were prepared to pick up the struggle as his career and life came to a close. Now, seeing Douglass speak was considered a quintessentially American event in the late 19th century. It actually often drew tourists to see him speak. Now, in this particular speech, Douglass asked hard questions of the country that would not be answered in his lifetime. Again, he said, "The United States government has made the Negro a citizen. Will it protect him as a citizen? This is the problem. It made him a soldier. Will it honor him as a patriot? This is the problem. It made him a voter. Will it defend his right to vote? This is the problem. This, I say, is more of a problem for the nation than for the Negro." Douglass, who helped win one of the most significant victories of social justice in world history, could not rest in his old age. I find it interesting how he used the word sufficient moral stamina in articulating what was necessary to defeat those white supremacists who were pushing back into national debate. Doing the right thing, he argued, takes a lot of hard work. He challenged Americans to resist allowing their nation to succumb to what he called lawless and nefarious mockery. The huge victory of the abolitionists, the gift of freedom that came with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and a Union victory in the Civil War, even that was not a decisive victory. It was a fragile one. And these days, we know all too well of the fragility of social progress in this country. Likewise, in his speech at Grinnell, Dr. King said rather famously now the following. He said, "One of the great liabilities of history is that all too many people find themselves in a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new mental attitudes and new mental outlook that the new situation demands." When we hear that quote, new mental outlook and new situation, it's easy to point to those we consider ignorant or reactionary and assume as those people, bigots, who need to develop new mental attitudes about race or gender or sexual orientation or immigration or a host of other issues. And of course, that's true. But I think both Douglass's speech and King's speech also illuminate the idea that progressive thinkers, like many of us in this room, must also develop new mental attitudes, new moral stamina, when faced with a great period of social change like the one we're in today. Because we may find ourselves on those busted staircases described by Hughes, precarious and struggling, fighting among ourselves, and losing track of the larger issues, the longer game, and the instructive voices of the past. Now, this new way of thinking, this new moral stamina, is difficult to develop. We want to believe that there's always a right answer or a wrong answer. But the new kind of thinking that I believe King advocated was one in which we looked at social progress on a continuum, King knew that he couldn't end poverty and end the Vietnam War and end segregation and secure civil rights with one speech, that he couldn't change policy overnight. Now, he did know that he could help move the nation, indeed lead the nation, to a new kind of moral thinking, infused with the precise moral stamina that Douglas spoke of. An overarching theme of equality as the truest ideal of our democracy. He knew he'd have to allow the smaller debates to be decided at the granular level. He didn't have the power or even the gifts, perhaps, to micromanage legislative policy, but he could lead the nations towards a new way of being. Now, I view Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King as positive thinkers, though not timid ones. A positive attitude is focused on what is right and how we achieve what is right. It doesn't give power to those who want to do harm. It remains fierce in the face of disagreement, and also manages to display a kind of fierce respect for fellow human beings as humans, even or especially those we disagree with. They knew to resist the temptation to think of your opponents as less than human, and therefore deserving no act of human kindness or generosity. Both Douglass and King could have quit, could have become discouraged, could have lost their focus on the huge social changes they were moving towards, and gotten caught up in small, petty offenses among their fellow progressives. To honor the work of Dr. King, we must resist the urge to hate and demean those who disagree with us. We must be cognizant that if justice work is a long game, hate is a short game, an exhausting one. It's easy to vilify and demonize each other on social media. But when we make hatred of the other the main fuel for the fire in our hearts, we risk doing no work beyond the demonization and the name-calling of those on the wrong side. We risk spending our energy on the fight rather than the future. We risk giving up out of exhaustion and despair, and most importantly, we risk damaging ourselves. King's entire philosophy was based on the radical embrace of love. It was a philosophy whose goal was the creation of the beloved community. I swore I wasn't going to do this. One of my favorite authors was James Baldwin. And let me say for the record that as a black gay teenager growing up in the African-American middle-class world of 1960s and 70s Baltimore, reading James Baldwin's novels and essays literally saved my life. You know, he wrote, "Hatred, which can destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated, and this was an immutable law." Baldwin was no pushover, which is saying something. He didn't compromise with evil, and yet I think Baldwin was cognizant of the spiritual destruction that comes when we give our hearts over to hate. And hatred can take many forms. And that progress is often halted when hatred of the other side takes over our thinking and our agenda. He also knew that as much as he often disagreed with his fellow liberals, especially white liberals, he also understood that they would need to be in constant dialogue to work against more pernicious and insidious forces. King spoke of the destructive power of hate in his speech at Grinnell. He spoke of seeing hate on the faces of Klansmen and saying to himself, "I'm not going to be that way, for hate is too great a burden to bear." While anger, frustration, and discontent can spur us to work harder for social change, hate is essentially unproductive and motionless. There are things in your life, if there are things in your life that cause you to feel the exhaustion of hate, whether it's social media or cable news or the way you view those who disagree with you, try to change them. Some battles will not go your way. Setbacks are inevitable. Try to leave hate behind. Try to free up your intellectual energy, as Douglass did, for the work that needs to be done. We must also remember and accept that most creative and lasting work is not linear in nature, whether it's activism or art or research or management. Almost no field of knowledge moves in a linear fashion, whether we are trying to diagnose a patient or develop treatments for mysterious medical conditions or change the culture of an institution. Our work will always be a series of steps and missteps, of trials and errors, of uncertainty and confusion, and none of this is avoidable. Now, of course, most of you know this intellectually, but it can be frustrating to experience it firsthand. Still, if you can remember that you are part of a large tradition of people who fought battles again and again, confronting them in new forms, of individuals and movements that adapted to a new challenge almost immediately after triumphing over an old one, it helps. Most of us go into the health professions to at least in part help alleviate human suffering. We have ideas that the healing arts we will learn will make the world a better place in some way. We believe that we will have an impact through our work, a meaningful impact that restores human dignity and wellness and works toward equality and progress. And yet, we usually have to do this work in the context of institutions and organizations and bureaucracies. We have to collaborate and cooperate. We will have to deal with paperwork, I guess I should say e-work, and committees and broken cultures and resistant colleagues and failed insurance systems. And yet we also know that there is very little we can achieve on our own. Sometimes we are charged with doing something that does not lead to our ideal outcome, but represents the best outcome for institutions we lead and serve at that time. No individual can live alone, Dr. King said at the crowd at Grinnell. No nation can live alone. We are interdependent. Now, the slow pace of change, the exhaustion of the work, the times when we feel we are taking 2 steps back for every step forward, this is also part of our interdependency. When the pace of change feels too slow or our progress too modest, we must remember that this is because we are moving an entire culture or an institution or a way of thinking forward. Even if we see the light, there can be miles of darkness around us. One of my mentors regularly told me, never mistake a clear vision for a short distance. The pace of change can be glacial because the scope of our challenges is often equally glacial. But movement is movement. Take pleasure in the small changes we effect, the small triumphs toward true justice that we can make. Now, I've spoken with great Grinnellian pride about that gathering on our campus where King spoke. We are rightfully proud of hosting that speech, but there are other things that happened that weekend during that symposium that we are less proud of, that we speak of rarely, if ever, and perhaps may be especially instructive because they are so painful to remember. I will now speak of one of those incidents. Now, during that now famous symposium at Grinnell in 1967, the novelist Ralph Ellison, whose landmark work, Invisible Man, had won the National Book Award, spoke on a panel during the meeting. Now, after the gathering had adjourned for the day, he attended a small party at a student's apartment with Willie Morris, a young white man who was the editor of Harper's Magazine, who was also serving on a panel. At one point during this party, Ellison was aggressively cornered and accused of being what we might call in 2019, not woke enough. He was directly and repeatedly called an Uncle Tom to his face. Now, in Willie Morris's memoir entitled New York Days, he describes Ellison, this intellectual and creative giant of his time, breaking down and sobbing after this encounter. When I first read of this encounter, it brought tears to my eyes. Ellison was attacked because he didn't fit into the box that others had decided he needed to be in. He was not liberal enough. He was not radical enough. He wasn't black enough. This man who was able to reach into himself and write this majestic piece of great literature that so accurately described the frustrations of so many African Americans of that era. But one of the challenges of being part of a marginalized group in this country is a belief of some that that identity is free of nuance. That if you're a progressive gay black man, for example, you should only think and be a certain way, and you will be told what that way is. Those who attacked Ellison so aggressively, I would argue, were motivated by rage and ultimately hatred. And sadly, it was not a unique occurrence for Ellison. Ellison was vilified by a significant part of the intellectual left of his day. and often shunned, but he won in the end. Today, the beauty of his writing remains. His novels and essays are incredibly meaningful testament to what it was like for so many to be a black individual in a white world in the last century, even in this century. And still, many wonder if the demonization he felt from his fellow liberals is a key reason why he didn't publish another novel during his lifetime. So I urge you today not to be consumed by anger and hatred, and to take time to nourish your brain and soul and heart, especially when you feel discouraged or exhausted, and not just by your enemies, but even by those who purportedly are on your side. This is harder to do than it seems, especially in 2019. You know, I've been attending meetings and discussions and symposia and colloquia at the so-called elite private colleges and universities of this country for the past 8.5 years that I've been president of Grinnell. And I suspect my experience would not be much different among other higher education communities. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard the word social justice noted, as I've done, in talking about our missions and our commitments in our communities, in our graduates. Probably 1,000 times I've heard that term. You know what words I've never heard in 8.5 years of talking about our missions or what we want our graduates to be or do? The words humility, kindness, compassion, empathy, reconciliation, love. Not once. As if you can have sustained and meaningful social justice without humility or kindness or empathy or compassion or reconciliation or love. It's as if we have deleted all the footnotes that go with the word social justice. Footnotes about the path to social justice and about the type of people we want to be on that path. And Dr. King spent a lot of time on those footnotes. I sometimes believe that we have lost our way as a community, and not because of escalating costs or liberal bias or the so-called snowflake students or any of the problems that have been alleged, but because we seem to have lost our souls as institutions. Every time I have an opinion piece published, our VP for Communications makes me promise not to read the online comments. And every time I read the online comments, and I usually regret not following her advice. But it's so hard to disconnect and to avoid being sucked into that angry online world of an eye for an eye. It is so hard to be thought a leader or an agent of change when you also want everyone to like you. And that's the most human desire, but I'm here to tell you, as I'm sure any college president or provost or dean or department chair can tell you, that will never happen. Prepare for the fact there will always be trolls, online or next to you in the same conference room. Sometimes you'll even be a troll, striking back with anger or hatred, and you'll need to step back and think about what you are and who you are, and maybe even apologize in humility, which I've had to do far too many times in my life and career. Now, from time to time, I think it's important to disconnect from email, from Twitter, deactivate your Facebook account if necessary, turn off the radio, news. You may even have to shelter yourself from the heated discussions colleagues are having in the hallway, or recuse yourself for a meeting or two from working on a particularly infuriating committee. Find a place to go that is out of the heated moment and the contemporary crucible, in other words. Honor that part of yourself that needs that quiet, that freedom to think freely, to step away from rage, and rediscover what underlies that desire for social justice and how you want to be as a person while getting to that goal. In so many of his great speeches, including the one he gave at Grinnell, King quotes poetry and literature. He turns to the arts and humanities not only for illustrative examples for his audience, but also, I believe, for his own private solace. This was not only because he was a bright, educated human who loved to read. I believe this was also because literature made him feel less lonely in the very public struggle he engaged in. You know, I was so impressed to learn about the amount of literature that President Obama read during his presidency. How did he find the time? Well, making sure you take the time to read, to experience the arts, take in a powerful film, or engage with a soaring piece of music is important for developing and maintaining the strength we need for the road ahead. The arts and humanities remind us that we are all human. And to again quote my favorite James Baldwin, he said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read." It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all people who were alive, who had ever been alive. James Baldwin. Finding ways to connect with those who struggled in the past, that old Southern tradition of visiting cemeteries, of connecting in whatever way with the ancestors whose stories we know from family lore, or with the great orators who left behind their revolutionary speeches, or with the great artists who left us their words or their work. Doing that reminds us of how unpredictable and nonlinear and still beautiful our life's work can be. So in that spirit, I want to end with another family story and an image. I've already spoken of my mother's family, so I'll close with the story from my father's side for equity purposes. Now, my father died in 2014 at age 91. He was a brilliant and eccentric intellectual, a physician, an internist, who had been born in Jamaica and was initially brought to this country through Ellis Island as an infant, where he was labeled as British and African, though he died without ever setting foot in Great Britain or Africa. I'm always surprised that many people don't realize that Jamaica and most of the other British colonies abolished slavery 30-plus years before the U.S. did. So while my mother had firsthand knowledge of her ancestors who had been born as slaves, my father really had no firsthand interactions with slaves or slavery, and Jamaica harbored one of the most brutal forms of slavery in the world. But there are a few stories on my father's side, and this is one. It's really just a vignette. I heard it at a dinner at a cousin's house, yes, after a family gathering for a funeral. Those occasions when we pause and remember and reflect. According to the story, one of my slave ancestors had a long history of forced labors that included fishing. And every day, he and the other fishermen slaves would take their canoes out in the Caribbean Sea along the southwest shore of Jamaica to catch fish for the plantation. Now, one day when the group was out fishing, they heard a strange sound. And the sound appeared to be the sound of church bells ringing. And soon, even over the dull roar of the sea waves, they could hear all the church bells in the nearby town ringing. But it wasn't Sunday, and it wasn't a holiday that might warrant ringing of the bells. So this was worrisome, unusual, even surreal. So the men pulled up their lines and nets, and as fast as they could, they rowed back to shore. When my ancestor reached the main dock of the town, there was pandemonium in the streets. He was said to have stopped someone to ask what was happening, why all the chaos. Then he was told the news. The year was 1833, and the bells were ringing because word had finally reached Jamaica that Parliament had passed the Slave Abolition Act to end slavery in most of the British colonies. In the middle of his tiresome, grueling work, he found unexpected freedom and triumph. It was a small moment, but one that must have been unimaginably wonderful and uplifting. And he surely told this story over and over for the rest of his life. Let me tell you how I learned when I was free. And it was passed down through at least 6 generations until it was told to me, a physician's son of a physician's son of Jamaica, sitting in a very nice, very middle-class dining room in the town of Savannah-Lamar in the Westmoreland parish of Jamaica. Now today, our family has a home in a still active fishing village on the southwest shore of Jamaica. And my spouse and I, University of Iowa professor, child psychiatry, Peter Daniolos, and our 2 boys, we regularly travel to that house overlooking the very waters where this ancestor no doubt regularly fished. Whenever I'm there, I think of this ancestor and I toast to his memory. What I often think about might seem odd. I wonder what was in his mind as he rowed to shore, in that gap of time between deciding that something had happened and reaching the shore to learn what had in fact happened. What was he thinking? Now, surely the slaves knew of the abolitionist movement, even in that remote corner of the empire. Did he allow himself, I wonder, to think that it might have happened, that the brutal system of oppression might soon end? Well, I've decided that he did, that he allowed himself the luxury to imagine that. You see, nothing ever changes in society. No disease is ever cured, no social problem ever solved without first imagining that things can change. It's a simple idea. The imagination creates the first step to any effort to improve the world. So as we remember Martin Luther King Jr. on this cold January day on the prairie in Iowa, I want to leave you with that image. You are in that rough-hewn canoe with my ancestor under the intense Caribbean sun, your adrenaline surging, stroking your paddle as fast as you can through the beautiful, brilliant blue sea waters toward the distant sound of church bells ringing, hoping, praying that though you left those shores that morning a slave, you might return a free man. Imagine that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.